Of all the quirks and idiosyncrasies found in Fringe's alternate universe, one of the most puzzling is their memorialization of former President Richard Nixon. His profile is featured on a silver dollar coin, minted in 1983. The coin's equivalent in our universe sports the profile of Dwight D. Eisenhower, under whom Nixon served as vice president. Of course, none of these coins were minted after 1978, save for 1983 special editions minted for the 1984 Olympic Games. However, the date that this coin was created will prove crucial in determining just how Richard Nixon fits into the alternate timeline. This is the question this video will attempt to answer. What exactly would garner Nixon this much respect? Not only is he featured on currency, but he has a parkway named after him in New York City. The following are two scenarios that will attempt to provide context to this oddity.
Richard Nixon on a silver dollar.
That's disturbing.
The first scenario features the fewest deviations from our own timeline and places Richard Nixon's presidency during roughly the same years as he served on our side. In this scenario, Nixon still faces Hubert Humphrey in the 1968 election. Nixon's campaign still runs the Southern strategy to attract conservative voters amid the country's racial turmoil following the death of Martin Luther King Jr. This would be consistent with King's profile being featured on the $20 bill. Since only deceased persons can be featured on US currency with only rare exceptions, King's death still occurring in 1968 would provide just as much impetus for him to replace a dead president on the bill, with more success in the alternate universe. However, this brings up one issue for Nixon. Assuming the law preventing living persons from being featured on currency still exists, Nixon would have to have died before 1983 to make it onto the coin. This quandary will become especially important for the second scenario, but an easy explanation could be provided for this. In 1974, Nixon underwent a surgical operation to treat his inflamed phlebitis, a vein disease which was plaguing the president during this time. If Nixon decided not to undergo the operation, historical records claim that his physicians told him he could have died. A distinct possibility is that Nixon made the choice to end his life early on the other side, meaning Gerald Ford would have been sworn in a few months later than over here. However, another major obstacle Nixon would have to have overcome to get his face on currency is avoiding Watergate. This could take the form of either a successful cover-up or a complete absence of the break-in on the other side, with either being a distinct possibility. As for the effects this would have on the 1976 election, that's another video topic in and of itself. Nixon also had a number of other accomplishments during his 2 terms. These included creation of the EPA, expansion of the Voting Rights Act, détente with the Soviet Union and China, as well as an end to the Vietnam War. In Fringe's alternate universe, it appears that the Vietnam War is replaced with the Aruba War, a Caribbean conflict that could tie in with the other side's more advanced technology due to a military buildup. The connection between Aruba and Vietnam, though tenuous, is backed up by writer Jeff Pinkner, who revealed that Aruba was intended to be a parallel conflict in an interview with the New York Post. Even if Pinkner's statement is not to be taken as fact and the Aruba War is supposed to be a later conflict, not a replacement for Vietnam, Nixon's de-escalation of the Soviet proxy war is still likely to have happened on the other side. Of course, Nixon also had other legislative proposals that he originally planned to get through, but didn't for various reasons. These include his proposal for a universal basic income and modest healthcare reform. However, both of these proposals are likely to have faced a similar fate as our timeline under this scenario. For one, it is clear that poverty still exists in the alternate universe. And 2, a successful healthcare mandate could have too many butterflies down the road, possibly interfering with Ronald Reagan's rise to power in 1980. Instead, what is likely is that Nixon's healthcare bill still stalled despite Gerald Ford's best attempts, meaning that the Democrats were still waiting for a better deal under the next administration. Whether or not they get their wish on the other side still depends on a number of factors. It is clear that the nature of healthcare is different in the alternate universe, but the legal and economic aspects are not really explored in the show. The person who wins the 1976 election could still be Jimmy Carter, as his advantages in the primary system had little to do with Watergate. However, as mentioned earlier, the 1976 election and its aftermath are best left to another video. Now, the second scenario that this video will explore is slightly more convoluted, although it has evidence in the show to back it up. Perhaps the date of the coin could hint at an important anniversary. What if Richard Nixon had actually won the 1960 election, instead of having to wait 8 years, and 1983 was the 20th anniversary of his assassination? Many online forums postulated this scenario, but in little detail. Here's an attempt to tie up some loose ends, although it should be noted that this scenario poses more questions than it does answers. Regardless, it's definitely possible that Nixon could have edged out Kennedy in the 1960 election. All he would have needed to do was flip 3 of the 5 states where the margin of victory was less than 1%. What would an early 1960s presidency look like for Nixon? Well, it would be short in this timeline, as Nixon presumably dies in 1963 at the hands of Lee Harvey Oswald or another assassin, as evidenced by the coin. We can make some inferences about his foreign policy, as this was Nixon's preferred area policy-wise as opposed to mainly domestic affairs. For one thing, the Berlin Wall wouldn't have come up as early as 1961, and the Cuban Missile Crisis probably wouldn't have occurred either, as Khrushchev likely wouldn't see Nixon as the young, inexperienced incumbent that he perceived Kennedy to be in our timeline. There is a lot of evidence to suggest that Nixon would have withdrawn forces from Vietnam before the conflict became too escalated, not because of any humanitarian streak, but because he wanted to build up military forces in Cuba in preparation for an invasion. Whether this invasion takes the shape of a successful Bay of Pigs or a successful Operation Northwoods is uncertain, but it does open up the possibility of a Soviet response in Aruba, and possibly the addition of Cuba as one of the stars on the American flag, though this is highly speculative. As for the fate of NASA and the moon landing, this could be accomplished in a similar fashion as in our timeline. Once Nixon is assassinated, his immediate successor, Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., could use Nixon's premature death as impetus to fund the historic Apollo missions. Similar reasoning could be used by Lodge to push for the Civil Rights Act with pressure from MLK and other civil rights activists. This is the same pressure that was experienced by Lyndon B. Johnson in our timeline. The effects of the signing of this bill by a Republican that would have on intra-party politics will be explored in a minute. It is imaginable that NASA in this timeline could be much more militarized, allowing for projects down the line such as the Strategic Defense Initiative to be taken more seriously. Along with war between the NATO forces and the Warsaw Pact in Aruba, this could also contribute to the more advanced technology seen in the show. As for the signing of the Civil Rights Acts, this would likely cause Republicans in the South to flee to the Democratic Party, whose southern branch itself could break off into a third major party, as somewhat evidenced in the show.
Polls show that most Americans oppose the proposed law to limit the number of children to 2 per family. However, leading politicians from 2 of the 3 major parties favor the law.
By the 21st century, this third party could have evolved into a populist party, leaving behind the racist elements of its past, though just as easily this third party could be the Libertarians, or another socially liberal political organization. Of course, the effects this party switch would have on future elections could pose a problem. Under this scenario, it is likely that Lodge is succeeded by John F. Kennedy in either 1968 or 1972, since Kennedy is confirmed as a former president in canon. His vice president would likely be someone like Hubert Humphrey, or another Northern liberal Democrat. Obviously, the second scenario poses far more questions than the first scenario, which is more familiar to us because of how our own history played out. However, we must remember that, as the premise of the show indicates, all possibilities are up for grabs when discussing an alternate reality. Thanks to Marcelo Solaris for requesting this video. I'm glad you've been enjoying my Fringe series. Also, thanks a ton to my contributors on Patreon. You're what keeps this channel going, especially in the age of reduced ad revenue. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.